Welcome to Party-Free. Today we are going to discuss about the decline of Polis. According to the common view, changes that took place in the 4th century BCE led to the failure of Greek polis, followed by a steady degeneration of virtually every political, social, cultural and other facet of civic life in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. A particular interpretation and employment of two interrelated developments form the basis for this view. Very recently, Philip A. Harland discussed this issue in an article titled "The Declining Polis: Religious Rivalries in Ancient Civic Context." First, according to the historians like Finlay, the Hellenistic age was a period in which the authority of the kings over their territories brought true freedom to an end and seriously undermined local autonomy through the ruler's policy of active interference in internal civic life. Autonomy, in its strict sense, is the essential ingredient without which the polis becomes an empty shell, causing a corresponding decay in other dimensions of civic life. More often than not, the turning point of the loss of autonomy and hence the beginning of the end of the polis is placed either at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE by the scholars like Lycurgus, or at the beginning of the Hellenistic age at the death of Alexander. Other scholars, such as A.H.M. Jones, argue that although the Hellenistic era saw the beginning of limited interference by the kings in civic life, thereby undermining self-government to some degree, such interference was limited and indirect. Jones places the climax of such control and intervention 5 centuries or so later than most other scholars under the Roman emperors, especially emphasizing its negative impact on civic life from the 2nd century CE onwards. Second, most scholars also focus on the supposed degeneration of democracy and the declining role of the assembly of the people. While democracy in the classical period is thought to have permitted the real participation of all strata of the population, giving even the lower classes an avenue of political activity and a sense of belonging, there is often presumed to have been a gradual disintegration of democracy in the Hellenistic era, with a corresponding detachment by the majority of the population from civic structures. Democracy by means of the assembly of the people was already in full decay, as G.E.M. Deisty Crookes argues. Corresponding to the death of democracy was the detachment of most inhabitants from civic identity or pride, especially in the lower social strata of society. There are several respects in which this overall scenario of decline is exaggerated and inadequate. Quite often, it seems to be an idealization of classical Athens, a reflection of scholars' value judgments that serves as the archetype against which the inferiority of cities in Hellenistic and Roman times is established. Rarely are the value judgments that accompany the idealization of the classical polis as blatant as when Amos Barker laments that those who have been touched by the tradition and educated by the philosophy of the Greek city-state may be permitted to stand by its grave and remember its life, to wonder what, under happier auspices, it might have achieved. In a critic of Sticrox's affirmation of the popularity of the Athenian Empire, Donald W. Brodin perceptively notes that most of us ancient historians have a sympathy for Athens and her empire. No matter how imperial we try to be, our whole training as classicists and possibly our political bent as well incline us that way. Classical Athens itself, however, may not have lived up to the scholarly ideal. Orlin W. Sachsenhause's recent study suggests that scholars still bring to the study of ancient democracy our conceptions of democracy as it has emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, often allowing modern values to shape a romantic view of Athenian democracy. We must also be cautious about assuming that classical Athens was typical, since it is the only polis of that era for which substantial evidence survives. As P.J. Rhodes points out, a variety of different constitutions were adopted by other cities in the classical era, some of which included varying combinations of democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy. Even if democratic Athens was, in some respects, typical of the earlier forms of the polis, and even if the decline scholars are justified in the degree to which they emphasize the loss of autonomy and democracy in subsequent years, such historical developments do not demonstrate the precipitous decline in civic life and identity scholars usually presume. Changes in one specific area, such as political participation, do not always equal degeneration in all others. A trend toward oligarchy, for example, does not mean that the lower social strata, which play less of a role in official political life, will necessarily feel dislocated and isolated from the social and religious facets of the polis, or lack a sense of identity in relation to civic structures. Moreover, recent years have seen the beginning of a shift away from the overall paradigm of decline, although the wake of such a shift has not yet reached disciplines such as our own. The shift is evident, for example, in a comparison of the first and second editions of the Cambridge Ancient History. Whereas a contributor to the 1927 edition concluded his discussion of politics in the 4th century BCE with a section entitled The End of the Polis, P.J. Rhodes's corresponding article in the 1994 edition concludes with a conspicuously interrogative section entitled The Failure of the Polis. Louis Robert, whose knowledge of the inscriptions of Asia Minor remains unparalleled, states, although cities such as Athens and Sparta no longer possessed their former power in international affairs, the internal structures of civic life in most cities remained largely unchanged. What was relatively new, however, was the emerging system of benefaction. P.J. Rhodes, Walter Eder, M.H. Hansen, Eric Gruen, and others question many of the key interpretations of previous scholars concerning the early crisis and decline of the polis, emphasizing instead the vitality of civic life in the Hellenistic and Roman eras despite changes and developments. Stephen Mitchell argues that despite the loss of complete autonomy for the cities in Asia Minor, there was still considerable continuity from earlier times. The cities continued as effective centers of administration, and perhaps more importantly, the cities were, in a very positive sense, communities. These and other recent studies call into question many scholars' specific historical interpretations concerning both autonomy and democracy, which are in need of considerable qualification or, in some cases, rejection. Most scholars who speak of decline hold in common a definition of the polis which emphasizes autonomy or autonomia or sovereignty as its essential ingredient. Hence, dependence on an outside power such as a king or emperor means loss of identity as a genuine polis and subsequent decline. This definition of the polis, however, is largely a product of modern scholarship, as Hansen's recent studies convincingly show. No ancient discussion of the nature of the polis mentions autonomy as a defining characteristic. Furthermore, many scholars have overstated the degree to which the Hellenistic kings and Roman authorities actively interfered in the affairs of the cities. Unfortunately, the model of civic decline has often been used to explain other social and cultural phenomena in the Hellenistic and Roman eras. Many scholars correlate this decline with a degeneration of traditional religious life. S.R.F. Price, in his The Birth of Classical Europe, notes that the conventional model, which has been applied to both Greek and Roman cults, posits an early apogee followed by a long and continuous decline until the last embers were extinguished by Christianity. Recent scholarship shows that the application of these other social and religious developments of both the model of civic decline and its related assumptions can produce misleading and exaggerated conclusions. This is the end of our today's discussion. Subscribe our YouTube channel, like our video and comment. Listen to our podcast episodes. Follow our official Facebook page, Twitter handle and Instagram. For more query, feel free to mail us. For details, see the description.